Hello everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. Most of the time, these videos look at the best cards in a particular category, but from time to time I like to change things up a bit and look at the absolute worst cards of a particular card type. So far, I've done Planeswalkers, Sorceries, and Artifacts, and today we're going to look at lands. In this video, I'm going to present the 10 lands printed in Magic that are the absolute worst. What makes them bad exactly? Well, not being playable in 99.9% of decks. This time around, I've provided some statistics to back up my argument that each of these cards is terrible, looking at how little these cards cost and how underplayed they are in EDH. Obviously, none of the cards on this list got anywhere near a Pro Tour or Grand Prix Top 8 either. They probably were never even played at such events. All of these cards, of course, see a little bit of play in EDH, and that's always a caveat for these, because EDH is such a diverse format, there are actually decks where these things can maybe work. But these are the least played lands in all of EDH, so let's get started. At number 10, I have Archaeological Dig, a land from Invasion that can either produce colorless mana or sacrifice itself to produce mana of any color. This is pretty bad as far as color fixing goes. In EDH, where fixing is usually pretty important, this thing only appears in 126 decks of the almost 20,000 decks on EDH Rec. Despite being an uncommon and a fairly old set, there's basically no demand for the card either, as you can pick it up for only 10 cents. This card is just bad because it asks too much of you for color fixing. You have to sacrifice it. In EDH, we have access to all the lands ever, basically, and there are literally hundreds that are better than this at producing mana. There are two EDH decks where this isn't horrendous, Titania, Protector of Argoth, and the Gitrog monster, but even in those decks, there are way better lands that sacrifice themselves. That's why, despite both of these decks being pretty popular, this still doesn't see much play. At number 9, we have Oasis. So, back in the day, Wizards made a lot of non-basic lands that didn't actually produce mana. They were almost zero mana artifacts or enchantments because of this, but of course they had the land creature type, and that meant you had to play it as one of your one lands a turn, which is definitely not something you want to be doing because you'll fall behind by one land if this is a land you're just trying to play on like turn 2 or 3. Oasis from Arabian Nights was one of these, and while some of those lands that produce no mana are actually kind of solid in EDH, like Island of Whack Whack or Tabernacle of Pendrell Vale, Oasis is terrible. You can use it to prevent damage, which is an okay effect and all, but the fact that you have to take a turn to play this instead of a mana-producing land is just terrible. Oasis shows up in only 125 decks on EDH Rec, and despite being from Magic's first ever expansion, where the average cost of the card is quite high, you can pick this thing up for less than $2. At number 8, we have Ristic Cave. The cave, for some reason I don't understand, has actually seen more play in EDH than number 9 and number 10 on this list, but obviously since I included it at number 8, I think it's just worse. This land does stone nothing if one of your opponents pays 1 mana. At least Oasis does something alongside not producing mana, right? Sure, this can produce any color, but your opponent basically has to leave 1 mana up every turn to make this card a blank. It gets even worse in multiplayer, where tons of people have the option to pay a single mana instead of only one opponent. Don't play this in your EDH deck like 159 people on EDH Rec have apparently decided to do. You can buy this for 8 cents, despite the fact that it is an uncommon from a set that is almost 20 years old. At number 7, we have Maze of Shadows. This land is basically a Maze of Ith that only works on creatures with shadow. Wizards often produces mechanic-hosing effects that work decently enough in a limited format. For example, this was actually an okay sideboard card that in Tempest Limited, as black-based decks were aggressive decks with lots of shadow. But because this particular mechanic, Shadow, appears on so few cards, Maze of Shadows is what we call parasitic, a card that really only works within one specific block or even set, and Maze of Shadows is all but useless these days because shadow creatures aren't running all over the place. That's why it's only in 55 decks in EDH Rec and why you can pick one up for only 7 cents. At number 6, we have Sheltered Valley. This is basically a land that produces only colorless mana, and if you control 3 or fewer lands, can gain you 1 life on your upkeep. There are lots of EDH decks that like gaining life, right? And the fact that this is a repeatable life gain trigger that costs 0 mana isn't bad, right? Well, wrong, because you have to be sitting around with 3 mana to trigger that life gain. If you're sitting at 3 mana, so you can gain 1 life a turn, you're going to be dead pretty quickly. This shows up in only 52 decks in EDH Rec, and you can buy it for 20 cents, despite the fact that the card is over 20 years old. At number 5, I have a whole cycle of lands, and I have Adventurer's Guildhouse here as the stand-in. There's a whole cycle of lands and legends that don't produce mana, another problem that we've seen already in other cards, but they allow your legends of whatever color to band with other legends. Banding is an old and complicated mechanic that allowed you to either attack or block in bands, which means you could have 2 creatures blocked together and you got a special bonus, or you could have 2 creatures attack together, and if your opponent blocked, you got a special bonus. And that special bonus is that you got to decide how combat damage was separated during combat among your opponent's creatures. This means you can do damage divided in any way you want, no matter how you block or they block. These lands are all pretty bad, mostly because there just aren't enough legends out there for it to be worth it. On average, these lands earn about 52 decks on EDH Rec. There is an actual home for the green and white part of this cycle because there are two generals who really care about legendary stuff. Reki, the History of Kamigawa, is green, and so Adventurer's Guildhouse isn't terrible, and Captain Sasei is green and white, and she likes legends too. So you can run both Adventurer's Guildhouse and the white card in this cycle. But even then, it isn't a staple in those decks. That's why they aren't played much, and why you can pick each of them up for about $1. At number 4, we have 2 lands. That is because they are functionally the same. Both are terrible, terrible filter lands. Filter lands are already not so good. These are lands where you pay 1 mana and tap the land to make a mana of any color, so basically, you have to tap 2 lands to gain 1 color of mana. Those effects usually aren't even good in Limited unless you're desperate for fixing, and they're certainly not good in EDH. So paying 2 mana and tapping a land to get whatever color you want is even worse, and that's what these do. Hardly anyone plays them in EDH, and the people who do are usually running a general like Karn, who can't run any of the basic lands, although wastes are around these days, so I guess you could run those. So a lot of junky colorless lands make the cut in decks like Karn, Silver Golem. You can get these for about 5 cents each, despite how old both of them are, especially School of the Unseen. At number 3, we have Winter Moon Mesa. This land only adds colorless mana, and it has an activated ability that isn't the worst thing. It lets you tap down your opponent's lands. This can often allow you to really mess up your opponent's turn. Problem is that it comes into play tapped, so you can't do it right away, and you have to sacrifice to tap the lands. Both of those things combined make this very bad. Like other lands that sacrifice themselves for mediocre effects, though, this does see a bit of play in the Gitrog monster and Titania. But even in those decks, it doesn't see a whole lot of play, as there are only 41 decks on all of EDH Rec that run the card, and despite being a rare from a set that came out all the way back in 2000, you can pick this up for 16 cents if you really want it. At number 2, we have another cycle of lands. The very first land's capable of producing 3 colors of mana, and Anhava Township is standing in for all of them here. Problem with these lands is they are basically all just really bad filter lands. Sure, they can produce 3 kinds of mana, but only at a very steep cost. Most filter lands at least let you produce any color you want, but here, paying 1 and tapping it only lets you produce green mana. And then, if you want to produce the other 2 colors, you have to pay 2 mana. Even in EDH, a format where flexible lands that can produce a lot of colors are often worthwhile, cards from this cycle basically see no play. And honestly, I can't think of any reason to run these. 30 decks in EDH Rec do run one of the cards in this cycle, but I'm pretty sure those people are doing it wrong. And at number 1, we have Sorrow's Path. This card is considered by many to just be the worst card in all of Magic, not just the worst land. This is another land that doesn't produce mana, so it already has that going against it, but on top of that, it has a super crappy effect. You can tap it to make it so that you can exchange 2 blocking creatures however you want. Now, that effect wouldn't be the worst thing ever, except that Sorrow's Path also does 2 damage to you and all of your creatures when it does this effect. This land also does absolutely nothing if your opponent is only blocking with a single creature. You can't exchange blockers if there's only one, right? So oftentimes it's completely useless, and when you really need it, it can just destroy your board state. Only 47 decks on EDH Rec run this, and I'm pretty sure those decks are just trolling us. The card costs $1.56, which is kind of a lot given how terrible it is, but I think this is just because people want to own a card that many consider the worst card ever. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. Next week I'll be back with a list that actually looks at some of the best cards in Magic instead of some of the worst. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. My MTG Top 10s are sponsored by 5colorcombo.com, a great website for Magic content and Magic accessories, and you can use my discount code NEEDTOHONE5 in their store for a 5% discount. Thanks for watching.